the woman who retained France on the map of the world, a young girl who made a military victory, who did not dream of a general, and the only Catholic saint in history, executed by the verdict of the church. All this, of course, is Jeanne d'Arc, one of the most contradictory and at the same time famous personalities in history. A scam or a peasant woman, a schizophrenic or a holy, brave warrior, or brilliant French propaganda? Strive up more comfortably, friends. In the next couple of minutes, we will cut off all myths and tell the real story of Jeanne d'Arc. Just because France, as a state, she really saved. And this is a documented fact. Well, this story began somewhere in the 1412. Somewhere this year, the girl Jeanne was born in the family of the foreman of the village of Domremy, in the county of Champagne. And before talking about her life, it is important to understand the situation in France at that moment. And she consisted in the yard for 75 years. Now a 100-year war was boiling. The King of England, Edward was the nephew of the French King Charles of IV. He died in 1328, not leaving his son. First, everything went well, and Edward recognized Philip of IV, cousin of the deceased King of France. But Philip decided to reduce the possession of England in continental Europe, and as a result, the possessions began to decrease with him, because Edward freaked out and recalled approval, officially claiming the rights to the throne. Word for word, and one of the longest conflicts in the history of mankind start. They began with arrows and bows, and ended with artillery and a firearm. In the literal sense, the question of the existence of France was in the literal sense, for the disassembly of two relatives dragged on and turned into an existential conflict, where everyone was ready to destroy the statehood of another. Moreover, by the beginning of the 15th century, England possessed an advantage. And in such a wonderful setting, Jeanne d'Arc was born. There is nothing to complain about. Father is the owner of 20 acres of land, and 200 francs of income francs at that time. Later, when the young Jeanne gets to the court, everyone will be surprised at her manners, and the myth will be born that the girl is an illegally born daughter of Duke of Orleans. In reality, he died 5 years before her birth, and manners are explained by a banal childhood in a rich family. This, in fact, is the second myth of Jeanne. It is simultaneously described as a tunnel of a pan and as the owner of excellent manners. Logically, something does not join here. The answer came to 1456, 25 years after the death of Jeanne and 3 years after the end of the Centenary War, when political engagement came to naught and began to objectively understand. The girl's godly parents spoke at the trial, and they said under the protocol that Jeanne was a quiet child, and her worst act was a secret visit to the closed areas of the church. The only place where the girl could be rude is the army. There is also evidence that Jeanne punished the knights for words, poor behavior, and a pass in the church. But they are soldiers in the 3rd century BC soldiers. That a return to how Jeanne got to them at all. Story began in 1425, when, at the age of 13, Madame d'Arc began to hear voices and see visions. It is clear here that history is separated again. Believers do not see anything strange about this. Skeptics speak of a tumor, brain, epilepsy, and even schizophrenia. It is clear that to the truth, given that Jeanne, let's say, was cremated, not to get to the bottom. But all sources and documents say that the girl had no cognitive problems, signs of dementia or emotional swing. Moreover, the English sources would not have lied to this issue exactly. The only thing that scientists do not deny was cattle tuberculosis or die. They often met in those days. Both diseases could give hallucinations, and both retained a person's mock. But scientists do not deny the authenticities of visions, because we are talking about the deeply believing Europe of the Middle Ages. When you believe the Fury, and you convince the body of it, he can calmly give you what he wants. We all went through this when the inner voice found 1,000 reasons to buy a Dane console and walk in torn pants. One way or another, at the age of 16, Jeanne d'Arc came to the city in Ocoliller, and told the head of the local garrison that the Archangel Michael personally told her that Jeanne was destined to take off the siege from the city of Orleans, to build a new king to the throne of France and expel the English invaders of the kingdom. That would be interesting to see the captain of Robert de Baudricourt. After all, the statement is not just bold, but super chic. Paris, by the time of the conversation in the 1428, is long for the British. France has the only city that blocks the British the path to the south of France. The candidate for King Charles VII literally thinks to blame Scotland, because the treasury remained in this very Paris. There is no money, there is no soldier, the gender of France for the enemy. And then a 16-year-old girl says that she can change everything. Robert Jeanne drove away to hell, but 3 years later, she returned and successfully predicted the defeat of the French troops in the future battle. Here, the captain of the Baudarts took the girl to the residence of the unrecognized king. It was then that we step on, perhaps, the most acute question in the history of Jeanne d'Arc. Did someone allow the girls to be like this in the gloomy Middle Ages? Yes, in general, yes. At least not to say that a resident of France of that era, a woman would not be surprising in the kitchen. What is Saint Genevieve, who, being a peasant woman, became a symbol of the salvation of Paris from the Huns in 451, or twice, the Queen of France, Eleanor Aquitaine? At the household level, of course, everything was simpler and not the reading of modernity. But in the same France, there were full women pupids, and if you look at modern women's forms in French 15th century, there will be a minimum of differences. But Captain Baudricourt is unlikely to be primarily surprised that a girl was standing in front of him. Moreover, if it were a 16-year-old guy, he would probably have received a kick under his ass. The innocent believer of Jeanne liked Baudricourt. Why? In those days, only a miracle could save France there in those days. Legend stated that the girl accurately recognized the seventh in the crowd of Charles, who arranged for her to check. But to believe in it weakly. Cher was staggering near Karl, and, God forbid, God's messenger would miss. There would have smelled of a coup. Romance should not be sought in the fact that Jean was given the troops in the Arc. This, firstly, did not happen right away, but secondly, as they said, the pious French were aware of the existence of Saint Genevieve, who saved Paris, and the legends that it would be reborn. And the situation at the front was such that they would believe in the pasta. The legend Charles VII just used to crown in the eyes of subjects to get approval through Jeanne of God. Well, and she, with a suicide squad, was on the relevant task, the release of Orly, which seemed impossible to the greatest generals. In just 4 days, the girl coped with the task, and there is no magic. Open a description of the battles of 100 years of war of 14-15 centuries, and you will see that the French are constantly in the majority, but all the time they lose, making idiotic decisions. Either will send cavalry to artillery, then infantry under archers, and then the ships will be tied with chains. This is an apotheosis of madness, which happened in the Terre Battle of 1340. It occurred to some genius to knit all French ships together. Here are the English and bypass methodically, shooting. Many historians, including us, agree that it was enough to simply not invent a bicycle for the victories of France, which, in fact, happened to Jeanne. Volunteers who heard about divine intervention pulled up. Several commanders returned, who believed that the king abandoned them, but also were really divine gift of the girl's convictions, 100%. They really went to death for her. And G managed to prevent a couple of next brilliant decisions of the generals. The result is the first tangible victory of France in 15 years, and the receipt of the Jeanne of the Orleans Virgin. And at the same time, hundreds of paintings that incorrectly draw her image as women with short hair and a sword. Jeanne really cut her hair, but according to her confession, she did not kill a single person. All that the girl did was drag the flag and encouraged fighter. It is also not worth believing the merit, because the advanced speech where courage is needed. Jean had her in bulk, which was talking about praise of even neutral knights. From this moment on, the status of a girl in France really became devout. Without even seeing her, people in all corners of the country believed in the possibility of victory. Jeanne herself successfully crowned Charles VII, almost without battles reaching Reims, because the British frankly fled. And then Jeanne demanded to lead the troops to Paris. The venture looked even more crazy than Orleans. 10,000 French soldiers could take 200,000 Paris, only if its inhabitants themselves opened the door. Quite logical, the girl did not grow together there. By this moment, the factor of surprise is gone, and the god, fearing the British, fell well. It was not possible to take them in a screech, and a more classic retreating France hack. Jeanne d'Arc fell under the distribution. Every now and then the question sounded about whether God turned away from the girl. Jeanne stopped giving the leadership of the troops, and in the 1430th, she herself with a couple of hundred volunteers went to free another city from the siege compires. The branded ship of Jean's sudden attacks were a long time ago, and the Burgundians who besieged Campion managed to deploy the troops, leading the girl's detachment in a 3-year minority. She ordered to retreat. She herself remained to cover the rear and was captured. In the Burgundians, in principle, were not against her France. Only now Charles VII did nothing for this, which is considered the most shameful betrayal in the history of the country. The British proposed 10,000 gold livres, having received a symbol of French resistance into their own hands. It was Schuster, and it was critical to the court that the case did not look attracted by the year. There were problems with this because Jeanne calmly answered all the questions, went around the verbal traps, and it was not possible to recognize her as a witch. Even terrible conditions of detention did not break the will of the girl. This only succeeded in a vile trick with a palm of the false document for signature. Jeanne signed in her own heresy, which led to her burning on May 29, 1431. The girl at that time was only 19 years old, and her life is without exaggeration the moment of a miracle in history. Without Jeanne, Orleans would really fall, and this would really most likely mean the disappearance of France from the world map. But she came and gave French society an impulse, which will later lead to a total victory over the British, and to an unprecedented event in history, an investigation of the process over Jeanne, which on July 7, 1456 was refuted at all points of the prosecution. The first process was declared invalid, and Jeanne returned a good name. In 1920, Roman Pope Benedict XV canonizes it as a Catholic saint. Yes, Jeanne did not win the war alone. Yes, she was not a feminist in the modern sense of the word. Yes, she was not even a warrior and a strategist. Well, but everything came together at the right time and in the right place. And Jeanne has become a symbol of France, which will come around in history more than once, and at the same time a symbol for millions of women who will later achieve electoral rights, freedoms, and rights to education. Well, if you liked our story, do not forget to subscribe and likes. Everyone see